Page 158, continued, para. A typical mode of payment to officers in the 11th and 12th centuries was to earmark regular and exclusive levies for them. Under the Kalachuris of Baghelkhand, lower functionaries such as Pattakilas, village headmen in charge of revenue collection, and Dushtadhyayas, police officials in charge of criminal administration, were paid in revenues. This can be inferred from a grant of Jaya Simha, 1163 to 88, to a Brahmana who is given a village with various rights including taxes, adaya, levied for Pattakilas and Dushtadhyayas. Footnote 148. Obviously, the Pattakila collected other royal revenues besides his own share as his remuneration, and as such, under weak rulers he could exercise some kind of control over the village land. But this cannot be said of the Dushtadhyaya, who was entitled only to his own portion. Taxes were also earmarked for three other kinds of officers: Visenima, Visnima, Vaishayika, and Artha Purusharika, 149, whose functions cannot be determined. Whatever might be the connection of these officials with the village land, there is no doubt that they were assigned certain revenues for their pay. This was not typical of the Kalachuris, for under the Chandelas, some lower officials, and under the Garhwalas, even higher officials, were apportioned specified revenues for their maintenance. Para. Under the Chandela, officers were assigned certain rights in the villages. This development began in the later half of the 12th century under Paramardin, whose religious grants of 1172 and 1178 enjoined the feudatories, royal officials, forest officials, constables, etc., to give up their perquisites in the village transferred as gift, 150. The practice continued under Trilokya Varman, in whose grant of 1208 to a hereditary Brahmana Rauta, only feudatories and royal officials are asked to give up the rights, 151. Whether these perquisites were allowed to royal officials in addition to their regular pay, either in kind or land grants, is not clear. But such a practice was bound to create intermediaries with some interest in the land of the tenants. We do not know whether the officials deprived of their rights were otherwise compensated. Nevertheless, occasional resumptions of such rights may have prevented perquisites from crystallizing into control over the land, which was further made difficult by the plurality of claim to the produce of the peasants. Page 159. Para. In the Garhwala kingdom, officials enjoyed certain specified source of revenue. The Akshapatalika, officer in charge of accounts and revenues, was entitled to his share of the produce, perhaps amounting to a prastha per household, known variously as Akshapatala Prastha, 152, or Akshapatal Adaya, 153. Another official, the Pratihara, doorkeeper or the head of the palace guards, was entitled to a similar share in the produce of the villagers, 154. We also come across a tax called Vishati Atu-Prastha 155, which on the analogy of the Akshapatala Prastha and Pratihara Prastha was a prastha of the produce paid to some officer. But it is difficult to find any equivalent of Vishatiyafu in the Gadavala list of officials, which is obviously not exhaustive. We wonder whether he was in charge of the revenue collection of 28 villages, since we come across a unit of 84 villages in a copper plate of Madanapala, 156. Whatever might be the position and function of this officer, it is not clear whether the prastha contribution made to those three officers accounted for their total remuneration or just formed an additional emolument. Here also, since the same peasant had to pay several officers, no one of them could claim rights over his land. Moreover, this practice was not widespread, for the three terms discussed above are mentioned only in the copper plates of the Maharaja Putra Govinda Chandra, 157. The term Akshapatala Prastha, Pratihara Prastha and Vishatiyatu Prastha are mentioned in the Basahi plate of 1104, 158. The term Akshapatal-Adaya occurs in a grant of 1109, 150, and the term Vimsatichabhata, perhaps a variation of Vishatiyahuprastha, in a grant of 1103. 160. It seems that towards the beginning of the 12th century /D, some Garhwala officials had become so powerful as to claim grants of perquisites for themselves. Printing is very hazy, para. The practice was limited under the Chehmanas, who, in order to support a class of military officers known as Baladhipas, imposed a special levy upon the villagers. A copper plate of 1162 records the grant of a cess called Baladip Abhabya of one village to one temple, footnote 163. But since in both cases the cess was levied from the villagers, page 160, it seems to have been one of the dues collected from the peasants and falls in the same category as the Akshapatala Prastha and Pratihara Prastha under the Garhwalas. But we have no means to determine whether the Baladhip Abhabya formed the whole or a part of the fee of the Baladhipa, who stood next in rank to the Senapati, para. The origin and evolution of the levies meant for various officials deserve some attention. What began in the early centuries of the Christian era as supply of provisions and rations for boarding and lodging such policemen and soldiers, charters and bhattas as visited the countryside to apprehend criminals, eventually developed into regular fees reserved for Patakila, Dushtadhyaya, Akshapatala, Pratihara, Baladhipa, and various other government functionaries, Rajapurushas. In earlier times, the provisions to be supplied by the villagers for the boarding and lodging of the touring officers are specified in the Vakataka, Pallava and Kadamba grants, 164. A small tax Vasati Danda was also levied for the purpose and probably collected in kind. 165. In the 6th century, a tax called Jemakakara Bakara was levied for providing meals to royal officers in some parts of Madhya Pradesh. 166. But the early grants do not speak of any regular dues meant for the remuneration of royal functionaries. The only tax that can be possibly interpreted in this light is Raj Abhabya, dues meant for members of the royal family, which appears in the Gupta period in some grants from central India. 167. In the later period, in the time of the Palas, Raja Bhabya, Raja Kulya, Raja Kul Abhabya, or Raja Kul Adeya was levied for the maintenance of the royal family. Generally, we do not come across these dues after the 10th century because members of the ruling family, princes and queens, were now assigned fiefs for their maintenance. But probably the system did not cover all the royal officials, some of whom were allotted definite dues for their upkeep. What was occasional contribution to lower royal functionaries and perhaps regular payment to the royal households in earlier times became a normal imposition for the support of some officers of the Kalachuris, Chandelas, Garavalas and Chehmanas. A parallel practice obtained under the Silaharas in Maharashtra, where hereditary holders of the office, page 161, of Narga Bhunda were not given gold for their salary but assigned certain taxes as long as they performed the functions of their office. 168. Hence, to specify items of revenue for payment of officers was a distinct development of this period. Para. Although both vassals and officials were paid in land grants, there existed certain differences between the two. Civil and military officers, such as the Purahitas, Jyotishis, Sandhi Vigrahas, Sachivas, Pratiharas, Mahasadhanikas, Mahamatyas, etc. were granted land for more or less well-defined functions which pertain to their respective offices. But the vassals had numerous functions to perform. The members of the ruling clan of the Chehmanas and Paramaras were possibly charged with all kinds of duties, executive, judicial and military, on the king's behalf in the area placed under them, and as fees they received personal estates comprising a certain number of villages. Similar undifferentiated functions were probably performed by many vassals who were not related to the king. Although the inscriptions mention numerous grades of vassals such as Raja, Raja Naka, Ranaka, Rajaputra, Thakura, Samanta, Mahasamanta, Mahasamantadhipati, Mahasamanta Ranaka, Samantaka Raja, Bhokta, Bhogika, Bhogijana, Bhogapatika, Brihad Bhogika, 169 etc. The surviving epigraphic records refer only to grants made to Samantas, Mahasamantas, Ranakas, Rajaputras and Mandalikas. How wide was the area entrusted to each category of these vassals is difficult to say. The Shukra Nitisara, which contains some terms used in the inscriptions of the 11th-12th centuries, defines a Samanta as the governor of 100 villages, yielding an annual revenue of 13 lakh karshas, 170. The same source states that the annual income of the Mandalika is from 3 lakh to 10 lakh karshas, 171. These statements may give some idea of the relative status of the vassals, but they cannot be taken literally. Whatever might be the size of the areas assigned to vassals, some Ranakas and Mandaleshwara enjoyed practical ownership of land for the executed religious grants without the permission of their overlords. In contrast to them, the officials, including the provincial governor, had to secure the order of their master in order to make such gifts. Further, many vassals were connected by blood with their lord, but, page 162, officials generally did not have such ties with the king. Even the vassals were not always related to the ruling house. The Palas granted land to the Kaivartas with whom they had no blood connections whatsoever. Similarly, there is nothing to show that the Samanta in Orissa and Ranakas in Gujarat were the kinsmen of their overlords. Most officials who were granted fiefs in the other parts of the country did not belong to the kin of the grantor, a feature characteristic of the Rajput polity in Rajasthan and Gujarat. Epigraphic evidence shows that in India, land grants were first made to priests and only later extended to non-priestly elements such as Brahmana, Kayastha and unrelated Kshatriya officials and vassals. The grant of land was not necessarily governed by the kinship principle, but by the need of rewarding services, para. The relation between the vassal and the lord in northern India during our period partly resembles the state of affairs in France and Germany, where the chief obligation of the vassals was to provide military service to their lord, 172. The literary and epigraphic records leave no doubt that the most important duty of the vassal was to furnish military aid to the lord. The Tilaka Manjari of Dhanapala has numerous references to show that the Samantas invariably accompanied the lord in military expeditions, 173. And the same impressions is created by Merutunga's Prabandha Chintamani 174, which shows that along with the Mantrins, the Samantas constituted an important element of the body politic. 175. Although the Palas maintained a standing army consisting of peoples of various nationalities, 176, the plight of Ramapala at the same time of the Kaivarta revolt shows how utterly dependent the later Palas were on the military aid of their feudatories. During our period, the dynasties of northern India probably relied more on the quotas supplied to them by their vassals than on their own forces. Perhaps each ruler kept some permanent military force, but how the soldiers were paid from the 11th century onwards is not known. Lakshmidhara, the minister of the Garhwala king Govinda Chandra, enjoys that in addition to their remuneration, Vetana, distinguished warriors should be rewarded with clothes and other things. 177. But the use of the term Vetana is not sufficient to establish that salaries were paid in cash. Page 163, para. Military beneficiaries appear as a very numerous class of grantees in our inscriptions and are known as the Rautars under the Chandelas and Garhwalas and the Rajaputras and the Chalukyas. The term Rauta is an early vernacular form of the Sanskrit Rajaputra, and it possibly indicated a rank in medieval times. In its literal meaning, the term can be applied only to the Chaimana and possibly the Chalukya Rajaputras, who were the scions of the respective royal families. But the Rautars in Bundelkhand and Uttar Pradesh belonged to the Brahmana, Kshatriya and Kayastha communities and were mostly unrelated to the ruling clan. The Chandela grants leave no doubt that the Rautars were granted land for military service. This possibly also accounts for 6 grants to the Kshatriya Rauta Rajyadhara Varman under the Garhwala king Jayachandra. Thus, the Rauta seems to have been a vassal whose dominant function in the state was rendering military service, which, according to the Lekha Paddhati, was also the most important obligation of his counterpart, the Rajaputra. A similar class of military vassals known as Nayakas, some of them of the Vaishya caste, existed under the eastern Gangas who made several land grants to them. The Shukra Niti Sara defines the Nayaka as a functionary appointed over 10 villages, but the inscriptions do not give any precise idea about his territorial jurisdiction. What is more important is that some families held the rank of Rauta or Nayaka, especially the first, consecutively for 3 generations. This led to the emergence of a considerable hereditary military class living on fiefs assigned to its members, 178. The new development, not found in earlier times, strongly reminds us of similar hereditary military families in Europe. Para. Inscriptions indicate that during this period the vassals played an important part in politics and administration. Their role in some succession disputes was decisive. The earlier case of Gopala is well known. In later times, succession to the throne seems to have been decided by the feudal elements. Here we may quote the examples of Salastambha in Assam, of the Somavangshi rulers of Orissa, and also of the Chaimanas. Thus, when Prithviraj II died sonless, the ministers who, in our opinion, were hardly different from feudal lords, brought over Someshwara from Gujarat and put him on the throne of Ajmer. On his death, page 164, they made the widowed queen Kapura Devi the regent for her minor son Prithviraj III, 179. Similarly, in Kashmir, along with the ministers, mantrins and ekangas, these samantas were sometimes summoned to choose the king, 180. Para. In certain areas during the 12th and 13th centuries, princes were not as free to make land grants as they had been earlier. The authority of the Mahamatya, who was a kind of highly feudalized ministerial functionary in the Chalukya kingdom, had to be invoked in the charters issued by the Chalukya rulers, a practice never followed in earlier times. While this did not fetter the hands of the donor, it certainly made him consult fully with the Mahamatyas in regard to land grants. Para. Early grants only name the officers, especially the Minister of Peace and War and the Dutaka responsible for the execution of the grant. They rarely indicate whether these officials approved of the grants, but some grants of our period, particularly of the late 12th and 13th centuries, record their consent to land gifts. Thus, a plate of the Paramara king Jayavarman II in 1260-61 records the approbation of the Sandhi Vigrahika, the Pandita Matadhara, to a grant of a village made by Jayavarman to some Brahmanas. 181. The growing importance of the vassals and officials in relation to land grants is also indicated by some Sena charters. Early Sena grants contain not more than two endorsements, one by the king and the other by the Mahasandhi Vigrahika. But the grants of the 25th and 27th year of the reign of Lakshmana Sena demonstrate the increasing dominance of high officials, mostly feudalized, whose favor and assent were considered desirable for the maintenance of the grants. A grant records the endorsement of as many as 5 dignitaries, probably including the king. 182. Para. Despite the influence exercised by the vassals in politics and administration, they were never organized in any group or council as in England. The term Samanta Chakra, the circle of vassals, so familiar in literature and inscriptions, is nothing more than a cliché which does not indicate any corporate body. Perhaps it was used in the same manner as Kavi Chakra, circle of poets. 183. The vassals may have constituted some sort of court presided over by the overlord, but it cannot be regarded as a deliberative assembly, page 165, through which the organized voice of the barons was expressed. At best, it seems to have been the prototype of the Darbar, which developed in Muslim times, and not of the Mother of Parliament, which developed in medieval England. The vassals may have performed judicial, legislative, and administrative functions separately in their respective jurisdictions, but they never did this jointly as a body. Nevertheless, these Samantas had come to be recognized as a hereditary social class, as can be inferred from the adjective Samanta Janma applied to Vakpati Raja Suri. It is said that although he was born as a Samanta, he attained the highest position among the leading poets. 184. Para. The general trend towards feudalizing officials reached its height during our period. This was reflected not only in paying them by land grants, but also in giving them high-sounding titles which were not meant to indicate their functions, but to emphasize their high rank. This tendency is most marked in Bengal and Bihar. Thus, a mere Mahamandalika Ishwara Ghosha, a feudatory of the palace, addresses his grant to more than 4 dozen officials, of whom 13 bear the prefix Maha, 185, great. Similarly, another Mahamandalika, Sangramagupta of South Munger, notifies his grant to various officials and dignitaries, 18 of whom bear the prefix Maha, 186. The charters of the Palas and the other dynasties of Bengal and Bihar mark a progressive rise in the number of officials with the prefix Maha in their designations. In the beginning, they mention 4 or 5 under Dharmapala and Devapala, later 9 under Narayanapala, Vallala Sena and Lakshmana Sena, next 17 under Ishwara Ghosha, and finally 18 under Sangrama Gupta when the feudalization of officials reaches its zenith. Here it is striking that the lower the power of the lord, the larger the number of the dignitaries bearing the title Maha in his kingdom, and similarly the later the kingdom, the greater the number of Maha bearing functionaries. Para. Curiously enough, feudal lords in other parts of India do not display much love of high-flown titles, except in the Kalachuri kingdom, where as many as 14 functionaries have the title Maha affixed to their names, 187. But the title Ranaka and Thakura, page 166, become common feudal epithets in northern India and are applied indiscriminately to officials of different castes and categories. This is best illustrated in the case of Kayastha scribes who were invested with these titles to indicate their feudal and social rank and not their functions. It seems that officials were placed in various feudal categories according to their political status and importance.